Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer evaluates a recent landmark judgment of the Supreme Court that was delivered in the Twaha Fazal case. Through this landmark judgment, the Supreme Court has provided for a new interpretation for certain controversial provisions of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. See, the UAPA, which was enacted in 1967, primarily deals with countering unlawful activities which pose a threat to the country's security and sovereignty. Over the years, the law has been repeatedly amended to introduce provisions related to terrorism as well. And today, the UAPA has become India's primary legal weapon against terrorism. But however, this law has often been criticized by legal experts and human rights activists, and it is even considered as a draconian law, which is often misused by the state and the security agencies to target those who are political opponents of the state. Experts are of the opinion that the UAPA contains very stringent and draconian provisions and provides wide sweeping powers to the authorities, which is often misused, and the law is often targeted against political dissidents in the name of fighting terrorism. Hence, UAPA has become one of the most controversial laws, despite it being the primary law against unlawful activities and terrorist activities. So recently, in the Twaha Fazal case, in which UAPA provisions were invoked, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment on the 28th of October. See, this case pertains to the state of Kerala, where three youths were arrested by the Kerala police and they were accused of being involved in terrorist activities due to their alleged connections with Maoist groups. Later, the case was handed to the NIA, or the National Investigation Agency, and the accused have been charged on the grounds that they possessed radical literature with them and allegedly they were associated with a terrorist outfit. So accordingly, Section 38 and Section 39 of the UAPA was invoked by the authorities, and they were even charged under a few relevant provisions of the Indian Penal Code. See, Section 38 of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act deals with offences relating to the membership of a terrorist organization. That is, if an individual is accused of being a member of a terror group, or if there is evidence to show his association with a terrorist organization, then he or she can be charged under Section 38 of UAPA, which attracts very stringent punishment. Then Section 39 of the Act deals with offences relating to support given to a terrorist outfit. So if there is some material to show that the accused has extended some kind of support to a terror group, then they can be charged under Section 39 of the Act. So in the Twaha Fazal case, the three accused were charged under both the sections, and they were even charged under Section 120B of the Indian Penal Code, which contains penal provisions for criminal conspiracy against the state. Then amongst the three accused, against Twaha Fazal, another provision of UAPA was also invoked, which was Section 13, which provides for punishment for unlawful activities against the state. So this case came up for hearing first at a trial court, and the trial court had rejected the arguments of the prosecution and had granted bail to the accused. Because the trial court had felt that the charges were on flimsy grounds, because these accused were arrested by the police just because they possessed few documents and books which had an inclination towards left-wing ideology. According to reports, the accused had a book on caste issues in India, and they even had reading material on left-wing thinkers such as Lenin, Karl Marx, etc. See, possessing these books or reading this literature is not exactly illegal. If an individual is reading up on radical extremist thought, and if he or she is studying different political ideologies, be it left-wing radical thought or right-wing radical thought, that alone is not proof of their involvement in any extremist activities, and it definitely is not proof enough to prove their association or involvement with a terrorist or an extremist organization. But in India, We have come across several cases where students, journalists, social activists, and political dissidents have been charged under UAPA, and terrorism related charges have been invoked against them just because they possess few books and documents. This is perceived by the security agencies as proof of their involvement or association with a terrorist or an extremist organization, and the stringent charges of UAPA are invoked, which results in their immediate arrest and indefinite jail time without even the provision of obtaining bail or to adequately prove their innocence in court. So, in the Twaha Fazal case, the trial court, which first looked at the case, found that the evidence provided by the prosecution was very flimsy and rejected their argument that possessing radical literature or books or documents cannot be construed as proof of their involvement with terrorist activities, and hence the trial court had granted them bail. But later, the prosecution took up the case at the Kerala High Court, which reversed the judgment of the trial court and denied bail to the accused, because the High Court was going with a strict interpretation of the UAPA as it has been provided in its stringent provisions. Then the matter reached the Supreme Court, and recently, in a landmark judgment, has granted bail to the accused by adopting a radical judicial approach, through which it has offered a new interpretation for the provisions of UAPA, thereby setting a new legal precedent and new jurisprudence for those who have been accused and jailed under the UAPA. In this landmark ruling, the Supreme Court adopted introspection and provided for a liberal interpretation of the law in order to protect personal liberty and human dignity. And it has stated that the mere association of an individual with an extremist group, or just the act of possessing certain documents or books or radical literature, is not sufficient enough grounds to attract the stringent provisions of UAPA, especially those related to terrorism. The Supreme Court has said that the burden lies on the prosecution to prove that the accused who have been charged with possessing radical documents or with associating with terror outfits, they should be proven to be having the intention of furthering terrorist activities for invoking the stringent provisions of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. See, this law is often criticized to be a draconian law, primarily on the grounds that it has very stringent provisions related to the question of bail. Section 43D, Clause 5, goes to the extent of denying bail to the accused, just on the grounds that the charges brought up by the prosecution appears to be prima facie true. That is, just on the face of it, if the judiciary is convinced that the charges brought up by the prosecution are found to be true, then that alone is sufficient to deny bail to the accused without any further investigation into the case. And it essentially gives rise to a situation where the judiciary has to blindly follow the charges brought up by the prosecution, thereby denying bail virtually in all the cases, which ends up compromising the fundamental rights of the accused, including their personal liberty and human dignity. Then, upon this, the law allows the police to retain the accused in custody for up to 180 days without even filing a charge sheet. So, when these two provisions are combined, it becomes almost impossible for the accused to get bail. And even in cases where the law is being misused to target political opponents, the accused will have to spend months together in jail without any relief, and the burden of proving their innocence entirely lies upon the accused. This is the other problem that has been pointed out by legal experts, because the UAPA is driven by the spirit of presumption of guilt on the part of the accused, instead of treating the accused as innocent until proven guilty. See, in any liberal constitutional democracy, the basic jurisprudence is that the accused is presumed to be innocent by the courts until they are proven guilty by the prosecution. So, in this case, the burden of proving the guilt of the accused lies upon the prosecution. And the accused from the very beginning of the case is presumed to be innocent, which helps in preventing the misuse of the law and the powers of the state. But in the case of UAPA, it is the other way around. Section 43E ensures that the burden of proof, that is, the burden of proving innocence, lies upon the accused, and the accused is presumed to be guilty, thereby forcing the judiciary to be bound by the views and opinions of the prosecution. So, upon this presumption of guilt, Section 43D, Clause 5 ensures that jail becomes the rule or the norm, whereas bail is not even granted as an exception. So, this, according to legal experts and human rights activists, is a gross violation of accepted norms of jurisprudence, and it results in the misuse and abuse of the law, where political opponents could be targeted by the authorities, thereby leading to the erosion of their fundamental rights and human rights. Recently, in a similar case, known as the Zahoor Ahmad Watali case, a two-judge bench of the Supreme Court had taken a different view by providing for a narrow interpretation of the law. See, the stringent provisions of the UAPA becomes a restriction on the judiciary and tightly binds the judiciary to go for a literal and mechanical interpretation of the law. So when bail cases come up under the law, the judiciary is often bound by the restrictive provisions, thus forcing the judiciary to go for a narrow interpretation of the law, and hence in most cases, bail is denied because the prosecution is easily able to show prima facie charges even on flimsy grounds, such as the possession of books and documents. But in the Twaha Fazal case, the Supreme Court has overturned its previous interpretation in the Zahoor Ahmad Shah Watali case, because here the Supreme Court adopted a liberal interpretation of the law, and instead of being tightly bound by the restrictions of the law, the Supreme Court has decided to adopt legal realism and judicial discretion, and in the process has delivered a radical judicial interpretation of the law. The Supreme Court has held that even in bail related cases under UAPA, the judiciary has the discretion and the authority to go for a constitutional reading of the law when there are chances that the fundamental rights and human rights of the accused could be violated. So if it becomes clear that the accused are being held on flimsy grounds, and if it prima facie appears to be a case of targeting political dissidents, then the Supreme Court has given itself space to adopt a liberal interpretation of the law through this landmark judgment in the Twaha Fazal case. The Supreme Court has made it clear that mere association with an organization or just possessing documents and books related to a particular political ideology is not sufficient to attract these stringent offenses, and the prosecution will have to prove that the accused had the intention of furthering terror activities, or else bail shall be granted to the accused in order to protect their fundamental rights such as personal liberty and human dignity. So through this landmark judgment, the Supreme Court has provided for a new interpretation of some of the provisions of UAPA and has set a new jurisprudence. So the writer hopes that this landmark judgment of the Supreme Court becomes a precedent in future cases under UAPA and should act as a formidable judicial authority against the blatant misuse of this law. Now let's take up another column from page number 6, which evaluates the AUKUS initiative between Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States. We have covered this topic repeatedly in previous classes, and we have understood that AUKUS is a defense and military initiative between these three countries to step up their security cooperation in the Pacific region. Under this initiative, the United States has proposed the transfer of nuclear submarine technology to Australia to strengthen its naval capabilities and to further the existing close defense relations between US, UK, and Australia. See, for US and UK, cooperation in the nuclear domain is nothing new because even since the Second World War days, US and UK have been working together in the field of nuclear technology. And back in the 1940s, when the US started building the first nuclear bomb under the Manhattan Project, it had already started sharing the nuclear weapons technology with the United Kingdom as a result of the close defense relations they enjoyed during the World War era. Then after the World War ended, in 1958, US and UK signed the Mutual Defense Agreement, through which they have had a long history of military cooperation extending to the nuclear domain as well. So these two close defense allies have taken forward their defense relationship with other like-minded countries such as Australia as well. In several areas of military and defense relations, these three countries already have a very close relationship, and they even take part in several joint military exercises. Australia is known to have contributed immensely to the war efforts of US and UK in Afghanistan and in Iraq, then these three countries are also part of an intelligence arrangement known as the Five Eyes, through which they conduct global electronic and cyber surveillance. And they're also known to cooperate in the field of cybersecurity and other emerging fields of technology such as artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. So, through AUKUS, these three countries are taking forward their defense relationship by introducing the nuclear element, where US and UK will transfer their nuclear submarine technology to Australia to strengthen its naval capabilities, with specific focus on the Pacific region. This, according to the writer, could rock China's strategy in the Indo Pacific. And according to him, the trilateral security grouping does provide significant advantages in countering China's aggression because of its primary focus on the Pacific region. This deal, however, has created few concerns and anxieties because it angered close allies of US such as France, as France felt betrayed by Australia. Because prior to signing the AUKUS initiative, Australia was all set to procure submarines from France, which was seen as one of the world's largest military deals. But all of a sudden, Australia backtracked on this commitment and cancelled the contract with France as it joined the AUKUS initiative with UK and Australia. But during the recent G20 summit, efforts have been made by the US to address the concerns of France as well, because the transatlantic partnership between these countries is also equally crucial for their respective geopolitical interests. So, even though France feels betrayed by Australia, it has come to accept the AUKUS initiative, and it does open up several opportunities in the Pacific region to offer a credible counter to the rising military aggression of China in the Pacific. Even though Australia denies that AUKUS is a military grouping, China has already criticized the initiative by labeling it as a military bloc, which is a reminder of the Cold War mentality. The writer expects China to play upon the sensitivities present in the ASEAN region in order to create possible roadblocks and challenges for the AUKUS grouping. See, when you look at the Pacific region, the ASEAN countries are considered to be at the center, as the 10 Southeast Asian countries which are part of ASEAN offer political and economic stability in the region. These Southeast Asian countries definitely have their own issues and problems with China, especially the South China dispute. But despite that, the ASEAN countries are divided internally on various issues, such as the question of current political situation in Myanmar and how the ASEAN grouping is going to deal with such violation of human rights taking place in one of its member states. Then within ASEAN, there is also an internal divide as to how they are going to deal with China. While few countries like Vietnam and Philippines have tried countering Chinese aggression, few others like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos already appear to be aligned with China, and other members such as Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia are concerned about unnecessarily antagonizing China. So it would be interesting to see how the ASEAN countries are going to react to the AUKUS initiative and whether they would welcome closer relations between AUKUS and the ASEAN group. Now, this would be particularly challenging for the ASEAN countries, not just because of the China question, but also because these countries have committed to the Treaty of Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, through which they have sworn to stay away from nuclear military technology. But the AUKUS initiative, on the other hand, brings in the nuclear component, which might create concerns for the ASEAN countries. Similar concerns will arise for other countries as well in the region, such as New Zealand and other small island states in South Pacific, because along with Australia, these countries have committed to the South Pacific Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. But Australia has stated that it is not pursuing nuclear weapons, but instead only strengthening its naval capabilities by procuring nuclear submarines from the US. So, if the AUKUS countries manage to convince the ASEAN countries and other countries like New Zealand that the region will still remain a nuclear weapons free zone and that they are limiting their nuclear cooperation only to the transfer of nuclear submarine technology, then it might actually encourage these countries to align with Australia, US, and UK, as they all share common concerns with regard to Chinese aggression in the region. It's in this regard that even Japan, another major power in the Pacific, has welcomed the AUKUS initiative because they know that it helps countries like Japan, New Zealand, and Australia to secure their strategic and trading interests in the Pacific, which currently is being threatened by the rising aggression of China. So, as China has emerged as a major global power, it has not only strengthened its military capabilities, particularly its naval capabilities and submarine fleet, but it has also stepped up its military aggression in the Pacific and as well as in the Indian Ocean region. For example, it has instigated maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea, leading to significant diplomatic and military tensions between China and some of the ASEAN countries. China has even displayed a lot of trade aggression and has tried engaging in trade wars with other major economic players of the region, such as Australia and Japan. Then China has even shown its military aggression against joint military exercises, such as the Talisman Sabre exercise, which is led by Australia and US, and has tried to aggressively monitor these exercises. So, this rising aggression of China in the Indo Pacific has pushed Australia to feel cornered and has served as a reminder of the setbacks it suffered during the Second World War. Despite its remote location in the Pacific, during the Second World War, Australia was targeted by Japanese submarines and fighter aircrafts, as both Australia and Japan were on the opposite sides of the World War, thereby creating an insecurity for Australia that despite its remote and faraway location, its maritime security and defense is not guaranteed. It was this bitter experience of Australia in the Second World War which led Australia to pursue a close strategic relationship with US and United Kingdom. And since Australia is even committed constitutionally to function under the British monarch as the head of the state, these three countries have long displayed common interests and objectives with regard to their defense and strategic priorities. So essentially, AUKUS is not an entirely new initiative between the three countries. But instead, through AUKUS, they are only taking their close defense relations further by including the nuclear submarine component, which allows Australia to function as an effective counter to the rising naval capabilities of China and also allows US and UK to deploy their proxy submarines in the Pacific to counter the rising Chinese threat in the Pacific region. Then the writer also points out that there is no conflict between the agenda of the quadrilateral grouping and the AUKUS initiative. See, Quad is an informal diplomatic grouping consisting of US, Australia, India, and Japan. Since the Quad was envisioned, it has been seen as a counter to China, but it has never taken the shape of a military grouping. Even though the Quad countries take part in joint exercises, such as the Malabar Naval Exercise, the Quad never had the mandate to step up defense cooperation or to create a military bloc in the Indo-Pacific. Initially, even though US, Australia, and Japan showed the interest, India backed out of such an arrangement, and hence, Quad neither has the mandate nor the capabilities to act as a military bloc. It has emerged as more of a diplomatic, strategic, and economic grouping to counter the strategic and economic domination of China in the Indo-Pacific. So this is where the Quad differs from the AUKUS. First, Quad is not a military group, and two, its focus is on the Indo-Pacific. Whereas AUKUS is clearly a defense and military alliance between three like-minded countries, and it is focused on the Pacific. So the writer says that this Pacific centricity of AUKUS doesn't challenge or counter the relevance of Quad because the Quad continues to retain its own unique strategic and economic significance, while the AUKUS provides a military platform to these three members to counter China's military aggression in the Pacific region. The writer even points out that the AUKUS members are even working together to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative by working on their own parallel initiatives, such as the Build Back Better World initiative launched during the recent G7 summit, along with the Blue Dot Network and Clean Network that these three countries are pursuing. Through such initiatives, they are planning to counter the strategic projects and infrastructure projects of China under its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. And along with that, they are gaining the military capability through AUKUS to counter China's military aggression in the Pacific. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6, which evaluates the recent decision of the central government, along with few state governments, to reduce taxes on petrol and diesel in order to provide some relief to the consumers from the exponential rise in fuel prices. Recently, the central government decided to cut back on central excise duty and even nudged the state governments ruled by the BJP to cut down their value added tax on petroleum products in order to provide a significant relief from high fuel prices. The editorial points out that the ruling party at the center and in these concerned states has definitely offered some relief to the consumers, but this has largely been done by keeping in mind upcoming elections. So, despite the electoral politics behind the decision, the editorial welcomes the move as it provides relief to the consumers, and the decision also has great significance for the overall economy. Because currently, the Indian economy is suffering from the twin challenge of lack of demand on one side as a result of the pandemic and rising inflation on the other hand. So, in this context, if fuel prices were to remain high and if they further continued moving higher based on international oil prices, it would have a devastating impact on transportation and industries and agriculture, thereby leading to more broad based inflation in the economy. This would also further reduce the purchasing power of Indians, thereby further curtailing demand and thus affecting the ongoing economic recovery. Hence, the editorial suggests that the governments need to move away from their electoral politics and by keeping in mind the best interests of the consumer and the economy, the current high taxes imposed on petroleum products, including on petrol and diesel, should be brought down by both the center and the state governments, especially at a time when the global oil prices are expected to surge as per the latest estimates of the World Bank. The World Bank has estimated that as global demand is coming back and as the global economy is staging a recovery from the pandemic and the lockdowns, the demand for oil also has shot up, thereby leading to exponential increases in global oil prices, which further places enormous strain on the consumer and as well as on the overall economy as a result of the high taxes that are being imposed by the center and the states on petroleum products. The editorial argues that there is more room for the central government and the state governments to cut taxes further so that some sort of relief could be provided to the consumers, not just for political and electoral reasons, but also to boost demand and to curb inflation, which is threatening the ongoing economic recovery. Now let's look at this article from page number 8. According to the article, Haryana's recent law on hiring has caused a lot of concern amongst the industry experts. So, the government of Haryana has recently introduced a controversial law which mandates the companies in the state to reserve 75% of jobs to locals. This law has been recently notified as well by the Haryana government and it comes into effect from next year, and it requires any company which employs more than 10 people to reserve 75% of all the jobs with salary of less than 30,000 per month to be exclusively offered to candidates who are domiciled in the state. This is being seen as a crippling restriction by the industry because especially high-end sectors such as information technology, automobiles, etc., they require highly skilled manpower and as well as highly efficient manpower irrespective of their domicile status. Industry experts have felt that such a conservative, narrow looking law will drive out these companies and both domestic and foreign investment into other suitable locations, which could not only be to the disadvantage of Haryana but to the disadvantage of India itself. Next, on page number 7, we have a column which explains the delayed payments under the Manrega scheme. I would request you to go through this column once because we have already covered this topic in detail on the 30th of October. So please watch the analysis once and then read the column as well. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: The judgment of the Supreme Court of India in the Twaha Fazal versus Union of India case has immense potential to reclaim the idea of personal liberty and human dignity. The court has acted in its introspective jurisdiction and deconstructed the provisions of UAPA with a great sense of legal realism. This paves the way for a formidable judicial authority against the blatant misuse of this law. Critically evaluate. The second question: AUKUS could rock China's boat in the Indo Pacific. Examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So, this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.